Okay, welcome to History on our YouTube channel, the Salt+Light YouTube channel. This is going to be the lesson 79. It's called Frontier Forts and Soldiers. It's a really fun topic. I visited a couple of these forts in Texas, but these frontier forts are actually all over the United States. So we'll visit a couple of these in this text. So have your text open if you can on the computer, and then you can have your workbook open to Lesson 79, Frontier Forts and Soldiers. As you know, what I've been doing is when I get to a point in a paragraph or on a subject that's in your workbook, I'll ring a bell like that. At that point, you can stop the video and go to your workbook and fill in your workbook. If you know some of these without without reading the text, you're more than welcome to do that. But I'm gonna do something a little different on this particular video. I'm going to have you look for the blue words, and I want you to write those in your sketchbook. Okay? There's about 5 blue words, and I'm not going to tell you where they are, but I want you all to be able to find them in the text. You've got the text in Classroom. Also, there's a reference to 2 of the books that we've read. It was called Growing Up Dakota. There's a reference to that book in the text in Classroom, and there's also a reference to the book that you're currently reading. I'd like y'all to be able to just, be able to find those and give me a little statement about what references were in the text about those 2 books. Okay, I'm going to try to keep this to around 20 minutes or so, 20 minutes or less, so here we go. Okay, Frontier Forts and Soldiers. The U.S. Army built frontier forts to help keep peace in the West. Soldiers and officers lived inside of these forts, as did families of many officers and some enlisted men. Other people who worked at the fort, such as woodworkers, blacksmiths, and laundresses, lived nearby. Frontier forts had officers' quarters, barracks for soldiers, storehouses for supplies, headquarters buildings, a hospital, a commissary, stables for horses, and a blockhouse, which is a strong building where the soldiers go if they need to defend the fort. These structures surrounded a parade ground where soldiers performed drills to prepare for their duties. Camp Supply in Indian Territory, which is pictured below on page 594 of your text, it had a stockade, but few frontier forts did. You may remember the stockade from the early settlers. Okay, that's where they all would gather in to be protected from whatever enemies would be attacking their settlement. Those inside the fort could go into the blockhouse for protection in case the fort was attacked. The blockhouse also became a place to imprison soldiers who needed to be disciplined for disobeying orders. Because as you know, soldiers need to be disciplined and obey orders. Soldiers at the forts protected workers while they were building railroads, and they protected settlers, mail coaches, and freight wagons using western trails. Okay, and then this is some pictures. This is a picture of Fort. This is a picture, if you can see that. It's in your text. This is Fort Concho in San Angelo, Texas. I haven't been there yet, but I've driven through San Angelo several times, and that's on my bucket list to stop at Fort Concho if I can get my wife to let me stop. I like to stop and read the roadside markers, but I actually have a book that lists all the roadside historical markers, so I don't have to stop. But sometimes it's fun to stop. Okay, so also on this picture, let me look through this picture right here. This is on page 596. This right here, let me get my camera right here. Yeah, this one here, over on this side, sorry. This is Fort Davis. Fort Davis in Texas, out in West Texas. It's a little city called Fort Davis, and this guy is a a soldier who's interpreting what it was like to be a soldier at Fort Davis. He's a historical reenactor. I've actually been to Fort Davis, and it's a really neat place to visit. You can go there and just imagine back in the 1880s, 1890s, what it was like to be a soldier out at one of those forts. So if y'all are ever out in West Texas, be sure and stop in Fort Davis and visit that really fun place. Okay, I've also got this highlighted right here. If you can see that on the camera right here. This is another fort barracks at Fort Larned, Kansas. And I guess I'll ring the bell there too. Fort Larned, Kansas. I rang the bell for a reason. You got to figure out why. Okay, so there was all the Native Americans that were out in the West where the settlers were moving after the Civil War. Well, actually, before and during the Civil War. So they were trying to find peace between the native nations. One responsibility of the soldiers at the frontier forts was keeping peace between American settlers and the many native nations who lived in the West. Some of these nations considered each other as enemies. The soldiers at frontier forts worked to keep peace between them. By the time Congress passed the Homestead Act in 1862, if you remember that, people could travel out west and set up a homestead, and they could claim land out there. So the U.S. government had forced many native nations to move from land in the east to the land west of the Mississippi. And that wasn't always, I don't always agree with that. That wasn't always fair. But that's another topic. We learned about the Cherokee Trail of Tears in Lesson 50, if you'll remember that. If you'd like to go back and review that in Lesson 50, that's in your text as well. You'd have to go back to Lesson 50. Nations who moved west were afraid of some of the native nations who already lived there. So these different native nations, as they began to move into each other's territory, they clashed. So the U.S. government forced nations to move west. When the U.S. government forced nations to move west, it signed treaties with them. In many of these treaties, the government assured these nations that they would protect them from other nations who were already living in the West. So there was a clash of civilizations here during this westward expansion of the United States during and after the Civil War. Okay, so peace between native nations and American citizens. Some treaties between native nations and the United States defined what land belonged to native nations and what land was available for American settlers. Soldiers at frontier forts helped to keep the settlers off the land that belonged to the native nations. Okay, this is why the Ingalls family had to leave their little house on the prairie in Kansas on page 588. Okay, so there's one of your references. Soldiers at frontier forts also worked to keep peace between American settlers and the various native nations. Treaties that eastern nations signed before they moved west assured them that the government would protect them from American settlers. American settlers asked the U.S. government to keep them safe too. So there was a lot of changes going along, a lot of people moving, expanding westward. They were going into stepping on each other's toes out there, the Native Americans and the settlers. So the U.S. government promised many nations that they would provide them with food and other necessities, sometimes in exchange for their land. The government set up many forts so that native nations could come to the forts to get the items that the U.S. government had promised to give them. So there's already a little bit of promises made, promises broken, because there was battles with native nations. Of course, when I say native nations, I'm referring to the Native Americans. And we've studied about a lot of these different Native American tribes that were here before we were. Okay, so Native Nations warriors and U.S. soldiers fought many battles from the 1840s to the 1880s. Frontier forts served as military headquarters and as supply depots for soldiers fighting these battles. In Growing Up Dakota, Charles Alexander Eastman tells about fighting between frontier soldiers and the Dakota Native nation before the Civil War. As a small child, he was with a band of Dakota who escaped to Canada to avoid conflict with the U.S. soldiers. And y'all will probably remember some of that story. Okay, so one of the most famous battles was when the Lakota Sioux were very upset with the U.S. troops because they were basically not keeping their part of the deal. They were letting the settlers move on to this territory that they were given, and it was sacred to them. Okay, so the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Maybe you've heard that. The Little Bighorn is a river in Wyoming. Okay, shortly after the Civil War, Chief Red Cloud and his Lakota warriors began to ambush. Look for that word. It's a blue word. Began to ambush travelers on the Bozeman Trail in Montana and Wyoming. Excuse me. 3 years after the war, they signed a treaty. They signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie with the United States. They agreed to move on to a reservation, which is now South Dakota, because they would no longer live a nomadic lifestyle. The government promised to give them food and other supplies because they couldn't go out and hunt their lifestyle, their nomadic lifestyle. Lakota Chief Sitting Bull and many other Lakota did not agree with the treaty. They decided not to abide by it. In 1876, Lakota warriors who followed Sitting Bull fought against U.S. soldiers in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Okay, and this is a picture of Sitting Bull. You'll have to look for that picture. That's part of your answer in the lesson. Okay, so Lakota warrior Crazy Horse was their leader. U.S. Lieutenant General George Armstrong Custer died in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Therefore, it is called, and I'm not going to tell y'all what it's called. Y'all tell me what it's called. The Lakota won the battle overwhelmingly. So I want to know what the name of the battle was between General Custer and Crazy Horse. Okay, so of course General Custer, he was a general in during the Civil War. He fought at many big battles, the Battle of Gettysburg for one of them. Okay, and then here's a picture in your text of some of the more famous Indian chiefs. This is Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and Red Cloud. So y'all can do some exploration on that and just find out about some of these very famous, very brave warriors. Some of them wanted peace. They wanted to work with the United States, but the United States unfortunately broke a lot of treaties and betrayed them, and they ended up on reservations. Really, really tragic story. So we need to pray for the Native Americans who are still on. They still live on reservations today. Okay, so a couple of these chiefs came to visit the president in let's see what year. I'm not sure what year they did, but they did come to visit the president. The president at the time was Rutherford B. Hayes, so they came to visit him. Who was it? Red Cloud and some of the Lakota chiefs after the Battle of the Little Bighorn. Okay, so that's a pretty famous story there too. Okay, so members of some native nations helped the U.S. soldiers. As we learned in Lesson 72, members of the Pawnee Nation served as security guards during the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. Crow and Arakawa scouts helped U.S. soldiers in the days before the Battle of the Little Bighorn. And there's a couple of good movies out about this era. One of them is Dancing with Wolves. That's a pretty good story about the frontier forts. So I don't know if your parents let you watch a movie like that, but it's not a bad movie. It's a pretty good movie with Kevin Costner, I think. But anyway, that's a good movie. Okay, so Buffalo Soldiers. Okay, after the Civil War, Congress created 4 new cavalry regiments Two of these, the 9th and the 10th U.S. Cavalry units, were all African American units. White officers commanded America's first African American professional soldiers to serve during peacetime. Both units served in frontier forts of the West. Congress also created 4 infantry, blue word, units composed of African Americans. Now, there were African American soldiers in the military during the Civil War, but I don't believe they didn't call them Buffalo Soldiers at that time. But we'll find out why they were called Buffalo Soldiers here in just a minute. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, so these African American soldiers came to be called Buffalo Soldiers. The source of the nickname is unclear. Some believe that Plains nations, that's the Plains Indian nations, call them this out of respect for their fighting abilities. You know, some people think it was because of their coarse hair, which kind of reminded them of a buffalo hide, but it's not really clear. I think it's because they were brave fighting. They had good fighting abilities. A lot of good stories about the Buffalo Soldiers. Several of them won the Congressional Medal of Honor. Okay, it's estimated that more than 12,000 African American men served in the U.S. Army during the late 1800s. Okay, Lieutenant Henry Ocean Flipper served as a Buffalo Soldier. Okay, the formerly enslaved Flipper had been educated at the American Missionary Association schools in his home state of Georgia. The year after Rutherford B. Hayes became president, Flipper became the first African American to graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point. Flipper wrote an autobiography, blue word, entitled The Colored Cadet at West Point. Note the dress uniform at right, and that's on page 599. It belonged to Second Lieutenant John Hanks Alexander. Lieutenant Alexander was born in Arkansas, the son of a formerly enslaved man who had purchased his own freedom and the freedom of most of his family. Alexander's parents made sure that their 7 children graduated from high school. Some went on to college. Alexander attended Oberlin College in Ohio. He entered West Point after spending 2 years at Oberlin. In 1887, Alexander became the second African American to graduate from West Point. He served as an officer with Buffalo Soldiers in Fort Robinson, Nebraska, and at Fort Washakie, Wyoming. Alexander died of heart disease at the age of 30. 1 month after he became a professor at Wilberforce University, where he taught military science. Okay, so a couple of important guys there. The very first black graduate of former, he used to be a slave. He was set free, and he went on to become very successful as a graduate of West Point, and the first graduate of West Point as a black man. Okay, this picture at the bottom down here, if you can see it, let me get my camera. I'm going to go the opposite direction here. Okay, this is I don't know if y'all can see that. Can y'all see that? Probably not. It's going to hide me, but anyway, this is a picture. This is a picture right here. You can see this guy. This is a picture of a Buffalo Soldier, and he is it's a monument to the Buffalo Soldier at Fort Riley, Kansas. Okay, so y'all need to study these pictures real good in the text, because there's some key things in some of these. Okay, so this is interesting here. Camels on the western frontier. I don't know if y'all knew this or not, but out in West Texas, I mentioned Fort Davis, and that's named after Jefferson Davis, who was I believe he was the Secretary of State under one of the presidents before Abraham Lincoln. Okay, well, Jefferson Davis served as the Secretary. Oh, here it is, right here. Well, if I'll just read the text, I'll see it. You will too. While Jefferson Davis served as the Secretary of War under President Franklin Pierce, he had the Army try and experiment with camels. He wanted to see if they could survive in the West and if they could haul supplies better than mules, because the military used mules at that time. Obviously, they didn't have trucks, so they used mules to haul their supplies. They hauled the supplies well, but the rocky terrain hurt their feet, and horses and mules were afraid of them. Many camels fell into Confederate hands during the Civil War because the Confederate forces took over Fort Davis in West Texas, because Texas was a part of the Confederacy. After the Civil War, the U.S. Army auctioned them off and began using railroads for carrying supplies. So some of those camels were just turned loose out in the desert, and some of them were given to circuses and things like that. So that's pretty interesting. When we were out in Fort Davis, out in actually Big Bend, there's a place you can stop on the road, and there's a plaque there. You can look out in the distance, and you can see up against the mountains. It says that the Army trailed the camels down that very trail. So you look out there and imagine troops with camels, either riding camels or having camels in tow carrying their supplies. So I thought that was interesting. So as we close here, let's look what the Apostle Paul says. When the Apostle Paul wanted to encourage Timothy to stand firm, he told them, and we can do this, because remember, we're talking about soldiers and forts and the frontier and the hardships of the frontier. It says, "Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ Jesus." And that's from 2 Timothy 2:3. So, anyway, you guys watch this video, have your workbook open. If you can somehow have your text open and read along, or I would suggest that you read the text first, along with the workbook. Maybe you can answer it, but you can watch this video and double check your answers, okay? So there's multiple ways you can do this. I have no way of proving that you watched the video, but that's what it's here for, to have a little bit of class time with you. So, but I would like you to reference the two literature books that we've read and are reading, and then write down the blue words and give me just a short little definition from the text of what you think they are, or not what you think they are, but what they are. Okay, so I've gone about 22 minutes. I'm going to post this. This is Monday evening about 5:30. So I'll post this, and I'll see if my technical department can get it posted to YouTube, and if they can, you'll get a notification once I see that it's there, and you can pick it up first thing this morning, or if you have time before you go to bed, you can watch it. But I think you'll have plenty of time to watch this if you haven't done lesson 79 already. But listen for the details, listen for the bell. Okay? Love you guys. See y'all Friday. Bye.